When and where do the sciences come from? Who's responsible for the systematized study of nature that has transformed the world over the past 5 centuries? Who do we talk about when we speak about the history of science? And importantly, what and who should we talk about?
Gianamar Giovannetti-Singh is now an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam. But before that, he completed his PhD at Cambridge University, whilst also serving as one of the RI's Freer Fellows. These fellowships are awarded to people in the final year of their PhD who are studying either the history of science, the history of the RI, or heritage conservation science. And Gianamar joined us to question whether the stories we've come to know about the history of science are all that accurate.
Popular narratives often tell a pointedly Eurocentric story about the history of science that focuses on a remarkably narrow cast of characters from a restricted geographical scope. Indeed, perhaps the most common story that we hear, the public-facing story about the origins of the modern sciences, is that sometime in the 1600s, Europeans experienced a drastic scientific revolution that rapidly transformed our understandings of the world. This story takes place in cities such as Pisa, Nuremberg, and Cambridge, and features figures such as Galileo, Copernicus, and Newton. Among the victims of this revolution, we are often told, were superstition, religion, and irrationality. The scientific revolution, so the story goes, gave way to the Enlightenment and eventually modernity itself. By paying closer attention to the original sources rather than more recent distortions, we'll see that the period we often associate with the scientific revolution was one of intense global interconnections. And in this period, people of disparate cultures contributed in meaningful ways to the knowledges that were emerging. These connections, it must be said, were not always good for people on both sides of the encounter. So often it was European colonialism that sparked cross-cultural interactions by bringing diverse cultural groups into close contact. Despite the often highly asymmetric power relations between interacting peoples in the early modern world, historians are starting to recover the scientific creativity of non-Europeans in these moments of cultural and intellectual encounter.
As Gianamar mentioned, there aren't many names bigger than Isaac Newton when it comes to the history of science, and many of us may tend to think of him as a lone genius who was fairly self-sufficient when it came to pioneering his scientific theories. But there's more to his story than meets the eye.
Newton was born in Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire in 1643. He joined Trinity College, Cambridge as an undergrad in 1661 and became a fellow of the college in October 1667, just 1 year after the Great Plague had fizzled out in England. He was elected Master of Trinity in 1669, became Master of the Royal Mint in London in 1699, so he was responsible for finding counterfeit coins and forgeries, and he was appointed President of the Royal Society in 1703. So in 1687, Newton famously published his Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which famously contained his 3 laws of motion, as well as the inverse square law of universal gravitation. So as many of you will know, this law it holds that the gravitational attraction between 2 bodies is proportional to the product of their masses divided by the square of the distance between them. Newton's an excellent example of how popular myths about the history of science take shape. He's frequently depicted as having been a cloistered, isolated genius who unraveled the deepest mysteries of the universe from his study in Trinity College, and of course from the famous apple orchard in his family's manor in Lincolnshire. The natural philosopher didn't travel that much in his lifetime, spending most of his time between Cambridge and London. Despite his theory carrying the label universal gravitation, implying its applicability across the cosmos, the theory appears, at least at first sight, to have been exclusively English and the product of a secluded, brilliant individual mind. But as historians have begun to look at how and from where Newton was able to collect the data to formulate his theory, an entirely different historical picture begins to take shape. and we start to see how dependent this supposedly secluded English man was on networks and infrastructures that spanned the globe. Indeed, far from being a cloistered individual, Newton was a part of a series of different early modern transcontinental networks, receiving data from correspondents and travelers across the planet. Moreover, Newton was financially plugged into a global system of slavery. He had a £20,000 share in the British South Sea Company, which is the equivalent of around £2 million today. A key problem for natural philosophers like Newton at the turn of the 18th century was working out the shape of the Earth. The Earth is not a perfect sphere, but is squashed at the poles, so the equators stick out. And a way of reverse engineering the planet's shape was to measure how long a pendulum would have to be at different points on the Earth's surface to swing with a period of 1 second. He worked with the Cambridge mathematician Roger Coates and the medic James Durin to revise his book on gravity, the Principia, to include pendulum swing data from the wider world, and importantly, to settle a dispute between the observations of different pendulum lengths needed to swing for a second, made by different French travelers near the equator. Newton ended up collating data recorded by the French astronomer Jean Richer at the infamous slave trading port of Cayenne in present-day French Guyana, and Gorée, the West African base of the French Compagnie du Sénégal. Were it not for the brutal transatlantic slave trade, Newton wouldn't have had the data to work out the shape of the Earth, which in turn was crucial to then be able to determine the variation in gravitational acceleration across different regions of the world. In Newton's life, it was a given that to determine universal laws, one had to collect data from all over the world. And to collect data from all over the world, European natural philosophers and natural historians relied on the infrastructure of the slave trade and colonial outposts. Newton came to rely on an extensive array of comet data as well. Though at the start of the 1680s, Newton didn't have his equation of universal gravitation yet, by studying much older comet observations, Newton came to realize that comets moved like planets along elliptical conic sections with the sun as one of the foci. He searched for any and every comet observation he could get his hands on. Newton ended up using data collected from across Europe, from Brazil, from Maryland in North America, and from China. Perhaps surprisingly, or perhaps not by this point, Newton owned twice as many books on overseas travel as he did on astronomy. And as an important note, it must be mentioned Newton's role in the Mint also put him into close contact with several non-European scientific practices. So one of his main tasks was assaying the purity of gold coins or guineas. The gold from these coins typically came from the Gold Coast in West Africa, and a key worry of European merchants was that the Akan people of West Africa would trick them by selling them impure gold. So Europeans came to rely on extensively on African-designed gold weights and African expertise in measuring the purity of the metal. Painting the Akan as a cunning people, the Dutch colonialist and trader Pieter de Marais wrote, "For us, Europeans, it is difficult to weigh with such scales. One has to be very experienced to know how to use them. If one weighs small quantities of gold with them, one has to watch very carefully. But among themselves, they know how to weigh so accurately that there is never a mistake." A map made by the historian of science Simon Schaffer shows where Newton got his sources from for the Principia, which European trade networks each set of data traveled along, which commodity was being extracted by Europeans in each place within this network. So if we return to our initial questions, which are who produces scientific knowledge or who's responsible for the production of scientific knowledge, where are scientific breakthroughs made, the case of Newton's data collection to put together his theory of gravity suggests that one, scientific knowledge is produced through huge, globe-spanning collective endeavors, often, as in the case of collecting data at slave ports, at an enormous cost to human life. This historical episode, I think, should challenge the isolated genius trope, which, despite remaining hugely popular in science TV programs and books, was simply impossible in as deeply networked a world as ours was in the early modern period, let alone today. This case also delocalizes and decenters the history of science from a small set of hugely privileged spaces, like Trinity College, Cambridge, the Royal Society of London. Although Newton's universal gravitation remains associated with those places in popular narratives, it was in fact a truly global, or one might say universal theory, and historians as well as scientists should bear this in mind and critically reflect on why we might continue to associate Newtonian physics with places like Cambridge.
And it wasn't just the development of theories that relied on international collaboration, it was new discoveries and trade as well. One of the most notorious examples of this category is the rise and fall of Canadian ginseng.
So now we go to New France, so today's Canada, at the start of the 18th century. The French Jesuit missionary Pierre Jatou had just sent a letter from northeast China that was published and sent to his fellow missionaries all over the world, announcing his discovery of a plant called ginseng. Jatou's letter hypothesized that if ginseng were to be found anywhere else in the world, it would most probably be Canada, because the Canadian mountains and forests closely resembled those of Manchuria. So the letter was excitedly read by the French Jesuit in Canada, Joseph-François Lafitau, who was staying at the Kanawake mission near Montreal today. Lafitau had trained as a missionary in many prestigious colleges across Europe, and he'd received some training in early modern European medicine, Galenism. He was familiar with its doctrines, which were first put forth by the Greek physician Claudius Galen around the year 100 CE. And these doctrines described every medicinal plant and animal as consisting of a different ratio of 4 different humours. So these are the 4 humours as understood in this period. So you had blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And each of these was associated with a particular hotness, coldness, wetness, or dryness, and with one of the 4 Aristotelian elements. And the humours were believed to form the basis of all life, essentially. And all people were considered to be made up of different proportions of these 4 humours, and the climate influenced those different proportions, as did their gender. As we see, some humours were considered more feminine, others more masculine. Galenism claimed that opposites cured. So what does that mean? It means if you suffered from a cold and wet disease, you could be cured by taking a hot and dry drug. So back to Lafitau. He spent nearly 3 months searching for ginseng. He was helped by an Iroquois woman, whose name he did not record. Together, Lafitau and the woman eventually found this plant not far from the Jesuit mission station. He named the plant Aureliana canadensis sinensibus ginseng iroquois garent oguen. So this means he's acknowledging that it's a Chinese plant, and the Chinese call it ginseng, that it's an Iroquois plant, and the Iroquois call it garent oguen. But of course, before everything, it's Aureliana. It's dedicated to the Duke of Orleans, who was the regent of France at the time. The missionary asked the Iroquois woman about ginseng's medicinal properties, and she explained that the Iroquois would eat the root to restore their energy when they were tired, and that it could even bring people back from the brink of death. Lafitau wrote up a medical description of the plant, although using the European language of Galenism instead of Iroquois medical categories, and sent it to the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris, where it was discussed by different doctors and scientists. Lafitau's use of Galenic language, which was highly universal in that it could be applied and stretched to describe all sorts of different drugs in different parts of the world, enabled Europeans to sell the root, to commodify it. So after Lafitau announced his discovery of ginseng in New France, which, surprise, surprise, was a French colony, it started to be traded by the French Indies Company all over the world and started a frenzy in global markets that were all keen to get their hands on the precious drug. The French Indies Company would buy ginseng from the Iroquois in New France at 3 francs per pound. They would then ship it to China, where they would sell it for 100 francs per pound. So that's a 3,000% markup. The Chinese were not fooled. They said, this is really bad stuff. We grow much better ginseng in China. Lafitau was the son of a wealthy wine merchant, and he was aware how profitable this route could be. And he noted that the Chinese are willing to buy Chinese ginseng, not Canadian one, at 3 times its weight in silver. So through his market-savvy decision to describe ginseng in terms that could be universally explained, the plant became a highly valued commodity in the 18th century world, and it was gradually incorporated into European understandings of medicine. Even though the medical descriptions and use of ginseng were communicated to European Jesuits by the Manchus in northeast China and by the Iroquois in New France, however, their knowledge and the work involved in harvesting the root were largely overlooked by European writers who, they gave the name, the second and third name, but that's about it. And they were mainly interested in the plant to generate huge profits. So the emergence and strengthening of worldwide economic networks through which Europeans accumulated an inordinate amount of wealth went hand in hand with the masking of scientific contributions of non-European peoples that continues to this day in popular science narratives. There are countless other cases of European botanists, in particular, drawing on different indigenous knowledges of plants and their medicinal properties and integrating them into their global sciences. Perhaps the best-known example in the history of science is the compilation of the Hortus Malabaricus Indicus by the Dutch East India Company military commander Hendrik Adriaan van Rede tot Drakenstein. Surprisingly, however, his book of the plants of the Malabar coast in South India acknowledged indigenous contributions, which was very rare. He included the plants' names in 3 languages and 4 scripts. So he wrote it in Malayam, in both Arabic and the local Arya Ezutu script, in Konkani language, written in a Sanskrit script, and in Latin. Van Rede tot Drakenstein even tried to compile a similar book of African plants with descriptions of their use by the Namakwa people of southern Africa. This book never made it to the printers, but some stunning manuscript paintings are in Dublin at the moment that document this major global scientific enterprise that never came to fruition. And it's also important to note that these activities, while mostly, were not exclusively the preserve of men. A case in point is the remarkable Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamensium by Maria Sibylla Merian, who has been called by David Attenborough one of the most significant contributors to the field of entomology. Merian travelled with her daughters Johanna and Dorothea to the Dutch colony of Suriname in 1699, and with extensive help from indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, she compiled this remarkable collection of images of plants and insects from the tropical region, which caused a huge splash when they were published in early 18th century Amsterdam. We'll move swiftly on to a final example, which is the development of modern surveying and cartography, much of which took place in British India. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, European navigators would use many maps of ports around the world, like rutters and sea charts, but they had very few continental maps. The global map, designed in 1514 by a Portuguese explorer, João da Lisboa, were the sort of charts that travelers used to navigate. European colonial settlements were mainly located along coastlines and at the mouths of rivers, so Europeans tended not to be that concerned with what was going on deeper into non-European regions' interiors. Moreover, European mapmakers, who tended to be based in cities like Paris, Amsterdam, and Seville, still generally got their information about foreign territories' geography through accounts by missionaries, merchants, and travelers, which were themselves put together through interactions with local peoples. As European powers like the British shifted their overseas political strategy from one of trade, unequal though much of it was, to military occupation and colonization, Mapping the interior of conquered territories became increasingly important. Detailed maps of a colony's interior were important to be able to know where one's borders were, which in turn let a central commanding government know when to deploy its troops if hostile neighboring states' armies were too close by. They were also extremely useful for the government to know how much tax to levy from the colony's subjects, based on how many crops could be cultivated on different people's lands. Before the British colonized the Indian subcontinent, much of it was ruled by the Mughal Empire. Shah Alam II of the Mughal dynasty ruled India as the British began to colonize its territories. The Mughals wanted to have detailed knowledge of the interior of their empire for much the same reason as the British did in the later 18th century. And as such, the Mughals developed many of the land surveying techniques that the British so desperately wanted to adopt. They would record their data in records of the patwari, or village accountants, whose documents could be regularly checked with higher-up state officials. The Mughal chronicler Muhammad Hadi Kamwar Khan, who worked for Shah Alam I, wrote about land surveyors who would go out on the Shah's campaigns and record distances between important landmarks in numerical tables, which were then transformed into maps called Naksha. Between the mid-1760s and 1770s, the Englishman James Rennell, born in Devonshire and orphaned as a boy, he travelled to India along the networks of the East India Company. He was tasked with surveying the Ganges-Brahmaputra river delta and started doing so using the traditional English coastal mapping technique that resulted in maps like the Portuguese Rota. When he returned to England in 1777, he began working on an atlas of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, which he published in 1783. A few years later, he published a map of the entire subcontinent. Somewhat surprisingly for his time, here Rennell acknowledged some local guides and servants who helped him put together the clearly different, interior-focused, detail-rich maps. He said that he was given information by an Indian soldier called Ghulam Muhammad, and in the 1793 edition of this map, Rennell explained that he owed much of his map to Sadanand, who he described as a Brahmin of uncommon genius and knowledge for his map of Gujarat, which he noted contains more matter within it than any other map of the tract. Rennell also made use of the Ain-i-Akbari cartographic tables compiled under the rule of the third Mughal emperor, Akbar I. The English surveyor described Akbar's tables as a register of the highest order. While Rennell relied on European-made maps to carefully chart India's coastline, drawing on the earlier charts made by French cartographers, his detailed map of the continent of the interior was predominantly shaped by geographical knowledge collected and shared by Indian informants and older Indian texts. Something remarkable about Rennell's map of Bengal, as well as his map of the subcontinent as a whole, is that they were very early examples of detailed interior maps, not just of India, but of anywhere in the world, including Britain. The Indian-British collaboration in map-making that resulted in Rennell's maps is what was taken later as a model for British maps of Britain. Rennell's Scottish friend William Roy, taking inspiration from the maps of India, encouraged the British government to map the British Isles and their interiors in the style of the Indian maps. Their pleas resulted in the establishment of the Ordnance Survey, which continues to make maps of Britain to this day. This historical episode, I think, shows quite how global the origins of some precision sciences were. British colonial cartographers relied extensively on local Indian land surveying techniques, data tables, and map-making styles with their focus on the interiors. So if we return to our key questions, who produces scientific knowledge, where have scientific advancements taken place, we can see yet again, like in the previous cases, that many of the people involved in producing scientific knowledge come from a huge range of different parts of the world, and these aren't just products of single European minds. From the Indian surveyors working for the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam I to James Rennell, to the soldier Ghulam Muhammad, to the unnamed Brahmin who taught Rennell about Gujarat's geography, to the Scotsman William Roy, All of them are part of this complex and messy story, with a huge number of people, both in places of privilege and very often in marginalized roles, who contribute to the production of new, often better, if we want to say that, knowledges about nature. So we should rethink popular science's attribution of discoveries to a select few, often European, often male, often wealthy, and almost always very socially privileged individuals. And as we rethink who produces scientific knowledge and where this knowledge is produced, we should also rethink how credit is and prestige are assigned in the sciences. Why is it that most of us hear only about this narrow cast of characters, but not the countless hidden figures who made these crucial contributions to the production of scientific knowledge? I hope it's clear by now that science doesn't exclusively belong to a small, select, privileged few, but rather the world itself is hugely complex, and people from all different cultures have investigated it for all sorts of different reasons at many different times throughout the world's history. In Mughal India, the study of land was important for taxation, and these methods were appropriated by British colonizers. In early modern West Africa, rice cultivation techniques pioneered by African women were appropriated by European slavers in the Carolinas in North America, who reaped the profits of the enslaved women's expertise and established an immense American rice industry, which is worth over $3 billion today. The sad thing is that science practiced in the modern world today continues to rely on the exploitation of marginalized people all over the world. Every scientific instrument that is used in labs is built in factories, typically in the global south. Modern science, like modern capitalism, cannot function without the upkeep of the supply chains involved in the production of instruments and their maintenance. Consider how much of daily life revolves around lithium batteries, for example. They're used in smartphones, solar panels, and yet, we could say without lithium batteries, it's difficult to envision scientific practice as it exists in the present. But we very often think about this only as they reach their endpoint, the batteries in the lab, in the smartphone, the defibrillator, after being mined, processed, driven, flown, administratively processed by countless hidden figures who are not credited as being integral parts of the story of scientific modernity. And I think we should critically reflect on why popular science on TV or in the media often ignores and erases these vital contributors, and how we can build a better story of the sciences, starting by acknowledging and crediting, both in terms of our narratives and hopefully materially as well, the people who make such knowledge and such cultures of knowledge possible. And, we can think about what recent calls to decolonize science and decolonize the history of science might mean, and perhaps they should begin with a recognition of how much science and colonialism shaped each other, and how science and imperialism continue to be imbricated in the present world. Scientific activity practiced historically across the planet has been put to remarkable use, developing life-saving vaccines against COVID-19 in record-breaking time, and understanding how our current economy is leading the planet to climate breakdown. But the character of the sciences is and always has been fundamentally collective and global, and I think it's high time for us as historians, as scientists, as citizens to acknowledge this. So globalizing and socializing our stories about the history of science doesn't mean to detract from the remarkable insights of the Galileos, the Newtons, the Darwins, but rather they can push us towards telling a more accurate, complete picture of how science was transformed by and subsequently transformed the world.
That's it for this episode. We hope you've taken away a more international and inquisitive outlook on the science we all know and love. Please do consider leaving us a rating or a review and subscribing to the podcast if you haven't already. And we'll be back with our next episode at the end of this month.